A senior U.S. general has been ordered to report to the White House and explain comments he's made about the Obama administration's Afghan policy. A U.S. congressional report says the country's taxpayers are indirectly funding the Afghan Taliban. What are the ramifications for the strategy of the U.S. and its allies in Afghanistan? And crucially, is there a united strategy at all? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. In an ironic twist of events, American citizens have discovered that it's their tax money that indirectly funds the Taliban, the very people their troops are fighting in Afghanistan. A congressional investigation revealed that millions of dollars spent by the U.S. military for security purposes has inadvertently gone into the pockets of the Taliban. The Defense Department has a $2.16 billion contract for transportation of supplies to the troops. The contract pays millions of dollars annually to local warlords across Afghanistan in exchange for gunmen to protect the supply convoys. Investigations reveal that these warlords would in turn pay Taliban fighters to ensure free passage. If they refused to pay, their convoys were often attacked. The report concluded this has undermined U.S. efforts to end corruption and build an effective Afghan government by unwittingly funding the insurgency. Joining me to discuss the topic, in Kabul, Thomas Ruttig, co-director of the Afghanistan Analyst Network, and Farooq Bashar, political analyst and a lecturer at Kabul University. In Washington, D.C., Brian Katulis, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Welcome all. Let's begin with Farooq Bashar in Kabul. What does this say about the coherence of U.S. strategy?
As you know, this rumor and as well as this investigation had started long way back. It was believed that those contractors, that they are providing ammunition and supplies to the NATO and to the U.S. soldiers, pay millions of dollars to the contractors, and contractors to have a safe passage of their convoys, they have to pay to the Taliban. What it means, indirectly, they are helping Taliban through the contractors. But this situation is not only that bad, the situation is worse than what is going on in Pakistan and Afghanistan with those attacks. Few weeks back, you heard that more than 50 trucks were exploded and millions of dollars were lost. So what is going on right now in Afghanistan, all of those materials and supply which are coming to Afghanistan is directly provided by the foreign contractors, and the Afghan government is not involved in that. Therefore, we do not know exactly, or the Afghan government and the Afghan people do not know how this money is paid, to whom it is paid, and why it is paid. What I believe that if any contract is taking place, they should involve the Afghan government. However, they are talking about the corruption in the Afghan government. I do not deny that there is corruption. However, more corruption exists with those foreign contractors providing services in Afghanistan.
Well, let's go to Brian Katulis at this particular point in Washington, D.C. And we've heard there the situation, the congressional report, but the question is, why has it taken a congressional report to make this public? The military has been conducting operations there for since 2001. This comes as a surprise to the military, does it?
No, and frankly, for those who watch Afghanistan closely, this is not a surprise to anyone here in Washington, D.C. There have been news reports that talk about this phenomena. What this report does is more comprehensively address the problem. So, again, this is not a big secret that's been kept under wraps. On my visits to Afghanistan, certainly a lot of people in the U.S. Government know that this was going on to get equipment into the country. And I think I'm glad that this puts the attention back on the issue of whether we're actually undermining the overall strategy, undermining the Afghan government, as your previous guest seemed to indicate in the approach that we're using. The one thing I'd like to highlight, though, in addition to funding, this is a source to the funding of the insurgency, there are other many sources of funding, too. There's the drug trade in Afghanistan. And as we know, throughout much of the Middle East and in Gulf Arab countries, there's been a lot of funding flowing into the Taliban for years. So this is one of many problems, and certainly I don't think the U.S. approach here is effective if we're actually funding some of the very people who are attacking our partners in Afghanistan and attacking our troops. But main point is that this is not a big news flash.
Well, Thomas Ruttick, in Kabul, we heard Farouk Bashar say that perhaps there is corruption within the Afghanistan government, but what this highlights as well is corruption among the contractors about which the Afghan government has no control whatsoever.
Well, I would see that a little bit differently, because there are a lot of different contractors. You have international companies, you have Afghan companies, and a lot of these Afghan companies also belong to people who are close to the Afghan government. So I would not say that the Afghan government is completely unaware of what's happening there. But this report, I think, very duly puts some light on an issue which is broader, which is about which allies we pick in Afghanistan as international community or as the United States. And it also highlights that the fronts are a little bit more unclear than Taliban on one side and the Afghan government on the other one. Many people in the Afghan government have also at least contacts to the other side. People in the provinces and the police, tribal leaders, they are sitting between a rock and a hard place, and they have to make up their mind who can reach me easier. Is it the international forces or the Afghan forces on one hand, or on the other hand the Taliban? And very often it's the Taliban. So they have to simply survive and have to make up their mind about with which side they are siding. And very often they decide to be a little bit balanced between both of them.
Well, let's look at another situation that's complicating the whole process within Afghanistan. General Stanley McChrystal, the top U.S. commander in Afghanistan, has been summoned to Washington. This in the wake of statements attributed to him in Rolling Stone magazine. Among the reported statements that General McChrystal felt betrayed by the U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, Carl Eikenberry. Some of his aides are also quoted as mocking Vice President Joe Biden and Richard Holbrooke, the special representative for the region. McChrystal is described as being disappointed in his first meeting with President Obama, who is quoted as calling unprepared. The general's reported comments cast focus again on the apparent disagreement he had last year with the White House, which was reluctant to agree to his request that more troops be deployed to Afghanistan. McChrystal has apologized, saying his part in the article was, and I quote, a mistake reflecting poor judgment. But meanwhile, Britain has announced that its special envoy to Afghanistan, Sherard Cowper-Coles, is taking an extended leave. This follows reports that he'd clashed with NATO and US officials over counter-Taliban strategy. The events indicate that long-simmering division among those jointly conducting a campaign against the Taliban is finally boiling over. Brian Kachulis in Washington, certainly there appears to be a great deal of confusion in a strategy being adopted by the allies.
Yeah, well, this instance with General McChrystal that you highlight, I think we're going to hear a lot about this in the next couple of days, and I think it's a really disappointing incident. I just read the article in Rolling Stone, and I'm puzzled as to why the commander-in-chief in Afghanistan can actually find time in his schedule to fly to Paris, and his inner circle got drunk in Paris right in April, right at the height of the war, as more troops are going to that country. It's terribly irresponsible. And if these statements are true, and it seems that General McChrystal so far has not denied them, he's just apologized for his lack of judgment, it raises serious questions about his fitness for command. And on his flight back to Washington, I'm sure he's going to be thinking about the statements he made, whether they're consistent with his oath that he took when he assumed command, whether he actually should be questioning the commander-in-chief, and then going back to the point you raised of whether the strategy he's outlined is truly viable. And if people, if he's operating in this way, which seems highly undisciplined, and it also seems inconsistent with how a leader should operate, I would really question whether he has the confidence of the United States and the President of the United States in implementing this strategy. So I think it's a very, bad sign in the face of some facts on the ground that aren't looking very positive for McChrystal's strategy.
Well, Thomas Ruttick in Kabul, part of the reason for the disappointment that McChrystal expressed with Karl Eikenberry was he claimed that Eikenberry had objected to his intent to bring more troops into Afghanistan when all of that was being debated. But this does appear to indicate a complete lack of a coherent strategy among Americans themselves as to how to address the situation, does it not?
I have the feeling that the US military in Afghanistan is dominating the whole show, and actually McChrystal is the one who is running the show, and I'm sure there's also disappointment on the other side. But we should not talk so much about persons, I would say. We should talk about the strategies and the concepts which they are standing for. And as much as I see that there's a lot of more understanding of the situation on the ground on the part of all the US actors in regard with Afghanistan, and that this is reflected in the new strategy, from my point of view, it comes 3, 4, or even 5 years too late. When we talk about the counterinsurgency strategy now in 2009 and 2010, which puts the Afghan population into the focal point, that comes much too late for me. And I'm sure that we have lost already too many Afghan hearts and minds.
Well, Farooq Bashar in Kabul as well.
Sorry.
I'd like to get your opinion on what Thomas Ruttick has just said there, that this apparent strategy is too late.
From the start, when the strategy was introduced by Mr. Obama, there was a confusion from the beginning. Mr. Obama said that they will leave Afghanistan as of July of 2011. Then McChrystal made another statement. They said, we will remain in this country as long as it is needed. A few weeks back, the Prime Minister of England came to Afghanistan and said that we will stay in Afghanistan as long as the Afghan police and the government is able to protect Afghanistan and they are able to fight the terrorists. Because if they do not fight with the terrorists, then their own cities will not remain safe. What I think that the statements which are made by different parts, for example, the White House said the other day that their plan is definite and they will start gradual leaving from Afghanistan. What it says that, to me, this strategy which was introduced by Mr. Obama at the beginning, it was misunderstood, as Mr. McChrystal said, and as well as it is not yet properly known to the NATO. NATO has one strategy in Afghanistan, and the US has another strategy. There should be a united strategy, and all of the powers, because they are the NATOs, should work together under one command, and they should start to prepare a situation in Afghanistan. The people of Afghanistan will trust them. For the time being, the Afghan government is always complaining that when they are doing the fightings, there are a lot of civilian casualties. And these civilian casualties has caused an enormous problem for the Afghan government and as well as for the Afghan people. And most of the Afghan people, they have lost their families, they have lost their properties, they have joined the Taliban. So this strategy from the beginning, which was introduced to Afghanistan, was not properly understood either by the NATO or by those that they interpreted Obama's policy.
Brian Katunis in Washington, your opinion about the lack of unity among the forces operating against Taliban?
Well, I've highlighted this in many of the things that I've written, that there really has been a lack of clarity about the end state that everybody's driving for. President Obama, in his speeches, has been consistent about an effect he wants to achieve, which is to disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Unfortunately, he nor anyone else, including the Afghan government, has not been clear about what it is we're actually trying to build. We've applied more troops. There's more money going into the country. There's somewhat of a counterinsurgency strategy, I think, but it's unclear. And the lack of clarity goes back to the lack of definition of what it is we're actually trying to build. How do the national governance structures in Afghanistan, including the police and the army, but also the civilian side of it, link up with the provincial and the local governance structures? There really hasn't been much of a clarity there. And without a clarity, if you don't know where you're going, then you're not going to get much far along that path. You really need to have a clarity of vision, and that's where I fault all the parties involved. We can point the fingers at the Obama administration. We could also point it at our NATO allies. And certainly, I think we've had a lack of consistent support from Afghan leaders to fight corruption and to really establish good governance and deliver to what most Afghan citizens want, which is basic services, security, and justice, which is one thing that I hear quite a lot from when I'm in Afghanistan. So
well, let's pick up on that point, if we may, on the question of Afghan governance. Now, in recent weeks, there have been major changes. You've had the resignation of the highly respected Interior Minister, the resignation of an intelligence chief who once again had the ear of many around the world. Now, these resignations purportedly because of security failures around the Jirga or gathered tribal meeting. But sources saying as well, Farouk Bashar, that these people had huge issues with the strategy that was being exercised by Karzai himself. What's your opinion?
It was clearly stated by the chief of the security that if we make peace with the Taliban, it would be a very wrong policy, because the Taliban is always funded and was helped financially and militarily by the ISI. The report says from the economic...
You're referring to the ISI, the Pakistan ISI, correct? The Pakistan ISI.
Yes. Let me explain that situation. The report which says that, the Economic University of England and as well as the other reports says that Mr. Zardari was directly involved with the head of the ISI talking to the 50 Taliban who they are in prison. And they were told that, we have arrested you because of the pressure which we have from the US government. What it means, they have, in fact, admitted that from the beginning till now, they are helping, aiding and abetting Taliban. And America is providing billions of dollars to the Pakistani government, and still there is no coherence activities over the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If Pakistan is not sincere in its activities to quash and quell the Taliban and to fight them to the last person, I believe we will not be able to bring peace in Afghanistan. The reason is that most of the Taliban, everybody knows that they are on the other side of the border, and they are always attacking Afghanistan. Today there was 10 NATO soldiers killed in Afghanistan. One of their helicopter was shot down or fall, as they say. It was accidental. But anyway, they shot a few days back another helicopter in Helmand. It means that people are gradually getting away from both, from the government and from the NATO, because they do not hear a coherent information or coherent statements from England, from NATO, and from the United States of America.
Well, let's go to Thomas Ruttick in Kabul and put that particular point to him. The issue that we do appear to have here as well is the question of whether Karzai is, in fact, the leader that Washington should be backing.
First, there have been a couple of elections in Afghanistan which admittedly have not been up to the standards, but we have to face the reality. I think, again, it's more about concepts and strategies than about persons. And there I see that there's not a congruent policy towards the approach towards the Taliban between the US and between President Karzai. Many here in Afghanistan are afraid, as the professor from Kabul University just said, that Karzai might go too quickly and embrace the Taliban. They are not so much afraid about generally talks with the Taliban or negotiations with them, but about that it is done too quickly and that a lot of that what have been achieved since the Taliban regime was toppled in 2001 would be thrown overboard. There needs to be a discussion about red lines, about what the Constitution says, about human rights, about freedoms for Afghans, and there are very diverse forces here in Afghanistan who are afraid that an accommodation with the Taliban could be too quick. But on the other hand, one thing is clear. The search has not worked. The Taliban are getting stronger. We just had the new UN report about a higher level of violence. I think we should not waste more time, and we should go forward and try to establish contacts with the Taliban and find out whether they also would be open for a political solution. I think many Afghans would welcome that if they know that their rights will be guaranteed in that process.
Well, Brian Katulis in Washington, that question of dialogue with the Taliban, your view?
Well, look, I think President Obama, but more importantly, President Karzai, has expressed an interest in reaching out to the Taliban. The question is whether the Taliban leadership would reciprocate and whether they're interested in this. It was notable to me that when Hamid Karzai organized a Loya Jirga recently, there were attacks on that Loya Jirga, and there's been this increase in violence. So that, you know, we have the statistics from the UN report, the increase in suicide bombings and roadside attacks and other things. The one fact that I think is essential to keep in mind is that most of the people being killed by these attacks are Afghan civilians. 70%, according to the UN report, 70% of these deaths are at the hands of the Taliban. Yes, there are incidents where U.S. Military has killed civilians, and it's awful, but the vast majority of violence where Afghan citizens are killed come from the Taliban.
Well,
so
Farooq Bashar in Kabul, let's just take that point to you and the issue of dialogue. Is it possible to have dialogue with the Taliban, and is it desirable?
You see what happened? Everybody in Afghanistan, including the government, wants to bring peace to the country. They do not have any kind of objection to this peace. However, to start dialogue, the beginning of the dialogue, which has happened, they are releasing a number of the Taliban. Those Taliban should have been tried by a law court, and they should have been either acquitted or should be sentenced to whatever, and then they should have been forgiven. Or we have seen many, many times that those Taliban that they have been released from the jails and they have joined again the Taliban, they have fought the government. To the best of my knowledge, yes, we do want peace. The United States, the United Nations, and Europe have agreed that we should have a dialogue. But to whom we should have dialogue? To the Taliban? Who's Taliban? To Mullah Omar, to Haqqani, or to whom? Right now, if we are calling Taliban the low-level Talibans, those are joining Afghanistan government because they have been displaced due to the war, due to the poverty, due to lack of jobs, and they do not have any income. They had, and their children, their families have been killed through bombings. A lot of civilians have been killed through these bombings. Most of the people have run out from Afghanistan because of the situation which has happened in Afghanistan.
Well, the question of dialogue, just one of the many issues that will be debated. Thanks to our guests, Thomas Ruttig and Farooq Bashar in Kabul, and Brian Katulis in Washington, D.C. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.